Welcome to Rooted in Retirement with Zach Gray. Zach is the founder of Rooted Wealth Advisors and is one of the nation's leading financial advisors, helping people answer some of retirement's biggest questions, covering topics like income, taxes, and Social Security.
So this is a place where we have to be really concerned about how much of this money am I going to keep?
Zach is here to make sure you can enjoy the retirement you deserve. This is Rooted in Retirement with Zach Gray.
Thanks for joining us today on Rooted in Retirement with Zach Gray. I'm Kelly Dame. You've worked hard to accumulate the money you'll need for retirement, and now might be the time, the best time, to consider how taxes might impact your ability to live your dream retirement. Today, we'll talk about how you can prepare for rising taxes in the future. Plus, in this week's Digging Deep, as we discuss concerns about rising taxes, Zach dives deep into what's going on with our country's debt situation. Zach, so great for you to be here with us today.
Thanks, Kelly. Always excited to be here with you.
Now, you are convinced, we're talking about taxes today, everyone's favorite subject.
Oh, yeah.
And you're convinced that in the future, taxes are going to be higher. So now really is the best time to start preparing so that the taxes in retirement don't really take a hit. So let's dive in.
Well, I don't know that I'm just putting my opinion out there. I think that I'm convinced because we know that if things don't change in Washington, things are going to sunset back to what we had in 2017 and prior. And what I mean by that is that taxes are going to go up for certain brackets. And so if you think about today's 12% tax bracket, it's going to be 15%, and 22%, it goes to 25, 24 to 28, and really the list just kind of keeps going on. On top of that, the standard deduction, it's in essence cut in half, and that's a bit of an issue as well. And so I don't think it's my opinion per se. I think that unless something drastically changes, well, taxes are going to have to go up. And I think that this is only the beginning, sadly, in terms of what might have to change with tax code moving forward.
It's just the reality, right, that we all face. Now, you believe that those actually who aren't preparing now may be the ones hardest hit in the future. So let's talk about how people can start to prepare themselves.
Well, I think that everyone just needs to take a look at where does their money sit? And what type of tax consequences might there be as you start to think about that moving forward? We have taxable investments like a maybe non-qualified account. We have tax-deferred investments where that might be something like an IRA or a traditional 401k. And then what I would consider to be tax-advantaged investments, something like a Roth 401k or Roth IRA. And what's interesting is that for most folks, the majority of their funds, it sits in something tax deferred, like an IRA, that traditional 401k. And that's kind of a slippery slope because you have a bit of a partner in those investments. Well, it's Uncle Sam, the IRS. And what's interesting about that is that they can change the rules at any point in time. We're talking about some rule changes with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was back in 2017. And now we're talking about, well, maybe that might be sunsetting going into 2026. So this is a place where we have to be really concerned about how much of this money am I going to keep? And it just continues to grow from there. There was the Secure Act that we just recently put into action, and that changed for the beneficiaries of those respective accounts. It's shortened the window, Kelly, which means we have to draw more and more money out of there. And by the way, we have to pay ordinary tax, maybe if it's you taking those dollars out, maybe for your husband if you left that money behind to a spouse, but also to kids or grandkids, whomever might be the beneficiaries on that account.
So it's a sobering reality when you mention they can change the goalposts at any time, and it's hard for us to be in control, so we need to be doing the things that we can. And I think it's especially hard for people who may have been told that their taxes are going to go down in retirement and they're going to have a fantastic way of life and everything will be fine.
Yeah, it's a bit of a myth that we believe that, taxes are going to be so much lower in our retirement years. And as we start to think about that, well, there's a lot of things that run through my mind. For example, I know that you have some children. Yep. I have 4 young kids. So now we have a credit and a deduction for them. It might not be the reason to have children, but we sure get a little bit of a tax break. And now as you start to think about, well, will I have that later in my life? No, not likely. Mortgages, most of the time, one of the goals is to get that paid off by the time that we're getting into those retirement years. And so as we start to think about, will I really be in a lesser tax position I don't know. We don't see that very often. You combine that with things such as Social Security. Up to 85% of Social Security can be taxed. And so now the question starts to lie, well, wait a minute, I've got that cash flow coming in. Maybe I've done a nice job saving into something like those traditional 401ks, traditional IRAs. And by the way, if you have something like a pension, that's another great cash flow. Are you really going to be at a lower tax position? And some of that even revolves around the fact, Kelly, do you want to take a pay cut in retirement? Well, I wouldn't want to. Most of my clients don't either.
Yeah, it's just, I can confirm as well that child tax credit is not the reason to have kids. But all of this is just really great insights to be thinking about. And if you at home aren't sure, if you've done all that you can to help protect your retirement dreams from taxes, you can call the number on your screen today. Now, coming up, Zach has some strategies for helping preserve your retirement income from higher taxes. That's coming up next. Stay tuned.
There are some things you can't avoid, but you can avoid overpaying taxes in retirement. You may think your taxes will go down in retirement, but that's not always true. In fact, sometimes your tax liability could go up. We're offering a free guide to show how you may be able to pay fewer taxes in retirement. Learn how different retirement accounts are taxed and options to help make your retirement income more tax efficient, all in easy to understand terms. Download this free tax guide now to help keep what's yours and avoid overpaying taxes in retirement.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us on Rooted in Retirement with Zach of Rooted Wealth Advisors. Higher tax rates are on the immediate horizon. In just a few short years, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expires, and along with the lower tax rates we currently enjoy. So, Zach, we're talking about how those tax rates are going to be just going higher. What is your take on all of this?
Well, I think that we're almost assured that they're going to be moving higher. We've talked a bit about this in the past, but I will say is that if you think back in time, today's numbers of maybe the highest bracket in the land being in the upper 30s, how does that compare? That's what really runs through a lot of people's heads. And I often say, well, if we get back to the 1940s, we see some of the highest rates we've ever seen. Sometimes that's hard to digest. We think, oh, that's so far back. But then I ask folks, well, what about the 1970s, especially a lot of our clients? And they think to themselves, oh, that's not that long ago. Well, in the 70s, the highest rate, well, it was in the 70s, right? And that was true for the 50s and the 60s. And so as you start to think about where we're at today, well, things were almost double back in the 1970s. Could it happen again? I don't know. But what I would say is that most likely things are going to be moving upwards. And why? Well, we have north of 30 trillion in debt currently. How are we going to handle that? How is that debt going to be paid? Well, projections as we push them out over the next 20, 30 years, we're in a position where just the interest on the debt alone is going to be very tough to service, depending on where interest rates go and so on and so forth. And of course, that's just been a really hot topic. And how will that affect the debt? And that's what gets really concerning to say, well, will things get worse? Will tax rates go up? Sadly, I think that is likely the answer to try to take care of some of these concerns. Oh, and by the way, Kelly, you have to keep in mind that right now, baby boomers are retiring at a massive clip. Almost 50% of boomers are already on Medicare. Medicare and healthcare costs are really the number one cost that we'll have in our retirement years. We want it to be travel, we want it to be spoiling the grandkids maybe. Sadly, it's probably healthcare. All 100% of them are going to be in that position here in about the next 8 years. And so you start to think about where we're at in terms of Medicare premiums today. Some of these big jumps that we've seen on Part B Medicare costs, and what's that going to look like as all of these boomers move into that full retirement, move into utilizing those Medicare benefits that they need to, of course, take care of their healthcare needs. I do believe that's going to cause some havoc, and it's something that we need to be planning for as we move forward. And as we start to look at even the second page, Kelly, of your Social Security statement, it states that the trust fund for Social Security is going to start to run dry somewhere maybe around 2035. That's really concerning. I think it's one of the reasons that taxes most likely will go up. And then that starts to prompt us to say, what are we doing? What are we doing right now to make sure that we're planning for what's coming our way.
Those numbers that you shared at the beginning of those tax rates being so high in the past, it's funny, we think about how things were just so much better back then and so much easier to make a living. And it's just interesting to see those numbers and get back in that perspective. So given some of this great information that you've given us, I think some of the questions on our viewers' minds are, okay, knowing what we know, how can we have a more assured retirement?
Well, I think that going back to the word planning, as I start to think about taxes, many times I think of the words tax preparation, and that's what I think most folks do. They get to the end of their tax year, they gather all their documents up and they bring it to their accountant or their CPA. And I think that happens just time in and time again. We don't necessarily start to think about, hey, what's going to be affecting us in the future? Could tax rates be higher in the future? What type of money might I even need in my retirement years? Oh, and by the way, Kelly, where am I even going to go to get those dollars? And so as I start to think about, what to do next, I would tell you the first thing to do is to get an in-depth tax analysis from my team. We consider it to be like a tax reduction report. The idea is to say, how much of our hard-earned money can we put in our own pocket or your purse to go spend for you and your spouse, your family, instead of having to have those dollars go to the IRS. And so starting to make sure that we plan for what's coming and developing a really solid plan for where we think things are going is incredibly important. The IRS, they give us a nice big old thick rule book every single year that's tax code. Most people probably aren't reading that on the weekends. Maybe you, Kelly. I don't know.
No.
Not happening.
No.
Okay. I just don't know that we always give it enough attention. And I believe at our firm, we have to take this comprehensive approach. Yes, income is important in retirement. Yes, investments, most definitely. Maybe some of those dollars for income are coming from our investments, but we have to think about the tax consequences of all of that hard-earned money. And you just need to make sure that you're working with someone that is taking that 30,000-foot view, that's really looking at all those intricate pieces, because it can drastically affect things, Kelly, moving into the future for, once again, yourself. If you're married, you and a spouse. Oh, and by the way, keep in mind that one of the largest tax rate jumps that we ever take is that, sadly, when one of us passes away, if we happen to be married. Now we go from a married filing joint rate to a single taxpayer rate. And statistically, Kelly, you're probably not going to pass away on the same day as your spouse. And so now you have to start to think about, what's this look like for the both of us? What's this look like if there's ever just one of us? And how does this even affect things like our children or grandchildren? And if someone's single watching the show today, of course, they already know that pressure's on their shoulders and their shoulders alone. So what do we do to stretch that money?
I think it's so ironic that you mentioned the IRS has a rule book, but we don't have a rule book in retirement. And you talk about planning, but there's really a customization aspect because people are coming to the table with a lot of different things.
Oh yeah, and I think, our Rooted Retirement process is really the process that we take viewers of the show through and start to understand, how can we maximize some of these things? Taxes just happens to be one of them, but I do think it's a critical show that we're talking about this today because it's something that's just not thought about a whole lot, and it leads us back to a position of saying, well, if we're going to our investments for income, how much of that do we actually get to keep from those portfolios, those 401ks, those IRAs, those dollars that we've put away to try to work for us over the years? That's incredibly important. And if we can keep more of that, once again, in our pocket versus having it slip away to potentially the IRS, frankly, it's all the better.
All right, thanks, Zach. And of course, a lot of important things we're talking about today. So coming up next in Digging Deep, Zach explains our country's debt situation. And later, he'll answer your viewer questions. But first, here's how you can reach Zach and the team at Rooted Wealth Advisors.
Congratulations, you did it! You worked hard and saved for retirement, but now you have questions. Could my taxes increase? How will I cover my expenses? Will my income last? You need a strategy to help make sure your hard-earned money goes the distance in retirement. That's why we're offering this free guide designed to help you determine if your nest egg can withstand the challenges of a 21st century retirement. Longer lives, increasing healthcare costs, and taxes are just a few of the possible risks to your income. Get the guide today and take the first step to help your money last in retirement.
Today we've been talking taxes and the possibility of those going up. Now Zach explains how our country has gotten to a point where government debt is practically out of control. Zach?
Well, as we've been discussing, the likelihood of higher taxes in the future, well, I want to explain what even got us to this point, that we have trillions of dollars in debt. We actually started out millions of dollars in debt right from the get-go. The Continental Congress didn't have a way to finance the Revolutionary War, so we had to borrow money from other nations as we were fighting to break away from Britain due to taxation without representation. But when we finally celebrated our independence at the end of the war in 1783, well, our brand new country and our brand new Department of Finance, they reported a total of $43 million owed to other countries like France and the Netherlands. By 1815, that national debt, it had gotten up to $120 million. But then in the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson, he stepped in and he took some action. He sold off some federally owned land, and he also blocked some spending on infrastructure, and our nation's debt was fully paid off in just 6 years. But then, if you remember from American history classes, you know what happens next. The Civil War broke out in the 1860s, and our national debt ballooned to $2.6 billion. It continued to grow over the next 70 years, and by the time that we got through World War I and emerged from the Great Depression, our national debt was over $33 billion after lending to other countries to help pay for military costs for World War II, as well as our own costs. At that point, our national debt hit $285 billion. Fast forward to the 1980s, and that's when we introduced the T word. Well, we were increasing defense spending along with some tax cuts, and that caused our national debt to hit $2.7 trillion. The Great Recession in the early 2000s, it brought us up to $12.3 trillion. And now, after a global pandemic and multiple rounds of stimulus packages, we are into the 30 trillion plus range in terms of our nation's debt. And we're still counting. So that gives you a history of how we got here. The question is, what happens next? It's unlikely that our government is going to be able to make enough cuts and freeze enough spending to make a big enough dent in this massive amount of debt. So most analysts are thinking that there's really likely only one solution. The taxes are simply going to have to go up to help deal with this debt. So no matter what your politics are or what you think the reasons behind all of this government spending is, well, we need to recognize that this is simply a math problem. At the end of the day, the spending, well, it's greater than what's coming in. So how do you help preserve your money from the threat of higher taxes? And that brings us to this question of stretching or preserving as much of our hard-earned money as possible. What do we do about it? Well, what I would say is that we need to be thinking about where does our money sit, for starters. I tend to think of our hard-earned money into really three categories. It's either going to be taxable in nature. This could be something as simple as a bank account. It grows, you're going to pay some tax on that growth. Tax-deferred investments, something like a traditional IRA, traditional 401k, 403b, the list goes on and on. The nice thing about this particular class of money is that when you put money in, you get a tax deduction, and that's great. It grows tax-deferred, but when we pull that money out, we will pay our highest ordinary income rate. So will taxes be higher in the future? And if they are, that bucket or that particular class of money, it needs a lot of optics. Now, tax-free or tax-advantaged dollars come next, and we would think of that to be something like a Roth IRA, Roth 401k. Some properly structured life insurance could fall into that category as well. So if we think taxes are going to be going up in the future, what should we be doing now? I think we should be shifting dollars to something more tax advantaged if at all possible. We do that in our office with something that we actually boil down to an SRT, a strategic Roth transfer. What can we be doing to maybe convert some of those tax deferred dollars and bringing them over to something like a Roth IRA, not having to pay tax on that growth ever again? Or even when we take the money back out of that respective category. That is where I think we should be trying to get most of our hard-earned money to. And so as we start to think about stretching money for, let's say, a spousal couple, that is something that's incredibly important because we know that, well, statistically speaking, we won't pass away on the same day. Most likely, one of those spouses will be a widow. And so now all of a sudden, we're looking at single tax rates instead of married tax rates. That's incredibly important. And even leaving that money to another generation, there's a much more tax advantage way to do so than to be leaving them in those tax deferred accounts that I mentioned earlier. So the question is, how do we help preserve more? I think we need to have a tax plan, and we need to work that plan, Kelly, as we move forward.
Digging deep in history today. Love it, Zach. Well, still to come, we'll hear directly from you in our Q&A section. Rooted in Retirement continues next.
You have a club for every scenario. A driver for the long holes. Wedges to get you over the hazards. And a putter for when you need a touch of finesse. What about your retirement? Will you have enough to play the back nine? Call to set your 15-minute phone visit today and let's find out. Get a second set of eyes on your retirement plan. Social Security. You've been paying into the system your whole career. Now it's time to get the most out of it. But with so many choices, what's the best strategy for you? And how can you maximize your benefits? Find out in this no-obligation Social Security report. Learn how your Social Security benefits can play a role in your overall retirement income plan. A lot of factors go into optimizing your benefits, and if you make an informed decision, you could end up with tens of thousands of extra dollars in retirement. You only get one chance to make the best decision for you. Take the first step and download the Social Security report today.
And now it's time to get to some of the questions you have for Zach today. You are in the hot seat. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, we'll be nice, I promise. So here's one from Lindsay, and she writes, I'm afraid my dad is going to worry himself to death, especially since he is constantly on social media. There's always some big scary headline that he's sharing with everyone all the time, and I don't think this is healthy. Anything you can share with me on how to talk to him about the financial news that seems to be scaring him all the time?
Well, this is something that we hear a lot about. And sadly, I think it's kind of gained steam over the last handful of years. We've got a really kind of polar media outlets that might be fighting each other in terms of getting some eyeballs, some attention. What I would say is just doing our best to make sure that we, of course, recognize the news and what's going on in the financial markets, in the economy, even throughout the world. And of course, there's just a lot of moving parts right now, and some of them are negative. I mean, it's sad to say, but that happens to be the case. But as I always tell my team, we have to control the controllables. And I would say the same thing to Lindsay's father, is to say, well, hey, what can we control at this moment? And as you start to think about this from the financial perspective, I would say that once again, having a good plan in place is the critical component that we're after. So yeah, let's take a look at a written income plan. What type of investments do we have? What's the risk associated with those investments? We can control those things. Taxes, we can control those to some extent. Most people don't think that we can, but that's a misnomer. We can do some shifting around. We can save into different types of accounts. And even as we start to think about legacy planning, we can make sure that things are set up the best way possible so that once again, we can live retirement on our terms and have the life that we've been dreaming of. So yes, it's tough. You get into social media, you kind of have the media speaking to you. It might be from the left, it might be from the right. I just would make sure that we're controlling what we can control and having a plan in place.
Great advice. Well, we have a new question now from Jessica, where she asks, my husband has been laid off after 27 years of factory work. We had a good amount of money saved in our emergency fund, so we didn't need to panic immediately. I think we're fine financially if he retires, but I don't think it will be mentally the right choice right now. Who should we talk to?
Well, us, of course, Kelly. That's why we do shows like this. You know, what I would say about that is good news first is that there was an emergency fund in place. And that emergency fund is critically important. You know, that rule of thumb of having 3 to 6 months of living expenses, I think is a good rule of thumb. You know, having some dollars put away for a rainy day or an unexpected expense is critically important. And it sounds like, you know, in this viewer question that, well, that was utilized and it was something that planning, well, it helped them, of course. I think now the question becomes, are we now ready for retirement? And it sounds as if there's maybe still some questions. I think making sure that you have the confidence in retirement is extremely, extremely important. And so, yes, there's an emotional component to retirement as well. And so maybe not going out on his own terms in this question is important to that individual. And that's okay. Maybe going back to the workforce, finding some place where you know, hey, I want to double check, make sure my foundation is well set, that I've got a plan in place that's going to last for some time. That could be something that could easily be done. And I know that it's easier said than done to go find maybe a different role, as this gentleman was laid off. But I would say that making sure that you have a plan that's concrete, that's giving you that confidence to really take you into retirement and through your retirement years, as we say, to and through retirement, it's very, very important. So I would say let's not move into retirement until we've double checked to make sure that we've given that kind of second opinion, if you will, to the plan in place. And then once again, maybe that point, the ball's in his court. Does he want to go back to work because he wants to, once again, go out on his own terms? There's nothing wrong with that. That could easily be done.
Confidence in retirement, which is great. Well, next we'll hear from Rick, and he says, I inherited an IRA from my father a few months ago, but I have no idea what to do with it. Where do I start?
Well, what I would say to Rick is what type of IRA? Let's just start there. If it's a traditional IRA, we now have some changes. The Secure Act that was enacted just a few short years ago, Kelly, it's now shortened the window, and we're forced to take more out over about a decade window. We used to have something called an inherited IRA option that could last an entire person's lifetime. It could maybe even be generational. We no longer have that. In my opinion, because we've been talking about taxes on the show some today, I think it's because we want to shorten that window, force folks to take more money out because we need some of that tax revenue. And let's just face it, if you can take a $1 million IRA, inherit it, and take it over an entire lifetime, or, Kelly, be forced to take it within a decade window, we know that we've got to take substantially more out of the investment, and we're left in a position where we're going up in terms of what taxes look like for us. So what I would say here, what type of IRA? And I say that because if it's in a Roth IRA, some folks don't know this, I would leave it in that Roth IRA format in an inherited IRA structure. You can leave it in there for that entire 10-year window, get all of that tax-free accumulation for the next 10 years, and then of course you can pull it out a decade later. If you pull it out now, Rick, you're left in a position where you're going to take those dollars out. There's no tax to be paid, and that's okay. That's great. But now you're going to bring it to a taxable account, most likely. And now you're left in a position where as it grows, well, guess what? We pay taxes on that money as we take it back out, or at least some tax on that money. So what type of IRA, Rick, do you have would be the first question I'd be asking. And then from there, we can start to plot our plan accordingly.
Well, I think you handled the hot seat well. Appreciate your answers and your insights, Zach.
Thank you.
Well, if you have a question, you, of course, can visit the website that we are sharing with you today. We just might use one of your questions on a future show. And don't hesitate to act on the information you've heard today. It never hurts to call, even if it's for a second opinion. Don't wait. Call now. For Zach and the team at Rooted Wealth Advisors, I'm Kelly Dame. Have a great day and an even better retirement.